Okay, so we are going to be talking a little bit about trends in Internet exchanges, specifically looking at the differences between exchanges that seem to be passing mostly or exclusively peering traffic, and ones that are passing mostly or exclusively, ones that are passing a significant amount of transit traffic, and how that's causing or may be causing a divergence in a number of characteristics of different kinds of exchanges. With me up here to discuss this, I have Keith Mitchell, who actually both of the gentlemen up here helped start PipeX, right? Early on, and Keith ran the links for some time. Phil Smith has been doing a lot of XchangePoint development and coordination in the Asia Pacific region, and I do a little bit all over the place. So for those of you who want to kind of follow along with the points each of the three of us are going to be trying to cover in this discussion, there are three URLs here. Mine and Phil's are on the PCH site. That's the PCH Documents, Papers, Transit Exchange, Peering Exchange / mine is an analog 0206, and his is an analog Asia IX. And Keith's is at www.exchangepoint.net, info, exchange, blah, blah, blah. So with that, I will start in on my short slide set and hope to have commentary from you guys. The two pieces of sort of old accepted wisdom that I think need to be re-examined are, first of all, that exchanges are functionally similar, that basically an exchange is an exchange, that they may be sort of qualitatively different, like this one is a good one, this one is a bad one, this is a small one, this one is a large one, but that they're all doing the same thing. And I don't think that's true anymore. The other thing is that people buy transit at their own location. That is, when you buy transit, somebody delivers a circuit to your office or your POP or whatever, and that people are going to exchanges to peer. But if we look at what's really happening in the world, there are some exchanges that seem to be priced very differently from others. Some are very expensive, some are very cheap. There are a lot of exchanges that are free, right? That is, the cost to a participant to go and put in a router and get a 100 meg port or a gig port or whatever is $0 per month. In the real world, of course, nothing is ever exactly free, right? Things that appear to be free are subsidized somehow, and that's the case here, but the fact that they have $0 cost to the participants is nevertheless the case. At the other end, there are exchanges that cost more than $10,000 a month. There are ones that cost more than $15,000 a month to go to and have a 100 meg or gigabit port. And in many cases, these exchanges are a very similar size, right? There are free exchanges and $15,000 a month exchanges where the free exchanges are larger or pass more traffic or have more participants or, you know, by any measure are larger exchanges. So there's not a correlation there at all. The other thing is that although historically it was very common for exchanges to have a rule that said no passing of transit traffic across the switch or no passing of transit traffic through the exchange, no, it's still in effect. So this is becoming very common. Someone will go to an exchange and they'll buy or sell transit there, either in addition to peering or to the exclusion of peering. So my hypothesis that I want to discuss here is that there are two poles on a continuum, right? That you could hypothetically have an exchange where only peering occurs, and you could also have an exchange where only transit is bought and sold and there isn't any peering. And in point of fact, there are a fair number of exchanges towards the ends of this continuum, that there are a fair number of exchanges that are maybe not 100% peering or 100% transit, but are fairly close to that on one side or other. And that it may be very difficult to make an exchange that serves both communities optimally. It may be much easier to sort of focus on one market or the other market and serve the needs of people doing either transit or peering, but it may be hard to find a good middle ground. So my analysis of this follows, and you guys are supposed to like interrupt and argue with me or something. All right. Okay. And some of these things are maybe a little bit controversial, but you'll see where it's going. Controversial statement number one is that redundancy is never needed on a peering path, right? The whole point of peering is to be redundant with your transit. And so some of you are going to say, oh, but only those people who aren't tier ones buy transit. Of course, that's nearly everybody. So statistically, it's enough of everybody that it's the way the world works. The peering is there as an economic optimization on your pre-existing transit routes. So there's no reason to pay more for peering than you would lose if your peering connection went down briefly, right? That is, you don't want to pay for reliability in a peering connection because you've already got the reliability through your transit. The point of the peering is to be cheap. It's to move the bits more cheaply than the transit would. So aggregation benefit, right? Glomming a lot of things together into one place in order to make a single big circuit that's less expensive than a whole lot of little ones would is okay in peering. That is, you're not giving up redundancy, you're not giving up reliability that you care about, and you are reducing the cost, which is exactly what you want. So aggregation benefits work really well in peering, right? Getting everything together in one place, one big potential point of failure that's really, really cheap. Transit, on the other hand, has to be reliable because that's your safety net, right? If you're selling transit, you either have to be buying transit or you have to be a tier one, which means in the real world you have to be buying transit. And you have to, if you're going to be reliable, not just be buying transit in one place, but buying transit from two or more providers. So that requires redundancy. That is, you don't want to be buying both of your transit connections in the same place, through the same router, through the same building. That means that you're willing to pay a premium to make sure that your transit connections are going through different facilities. So, two columns here, peering exchange column and transit exchange column, trying to characterize differences between them. Maximizing aggregation benefit implies that in a peering exchange, you only want to have one in a region, whatever region means to you, and that it needs to be as big as possible, as many potential peers as possible in one place, so you can reach them all with one expenditure and keep that expenditure to a minimum. In transit exchange, on the other hand, you want two or more of them in a region, and you really don't care how many people are at any one of them as long as there are three or more participants there, right? You need three or more to have, basically to have a market environment operating. So the sort of ideal minimum case for transit exchanges is two of them in, say, a metro area with three participants each. And beyond that, you don't care too much. Having one is not as good as having two, whereas with the peering exchange, having one is much, much better than having two. So kind of opposite forces at work there. Switch fabrics are also a different case. In a peering exchange, if there are multiple facilities, which is not a bad thing, you still need them all to be connected together at layer 2 so that you can peer with everybody using only your one piece of equipment, right? So you don't have to go and be a customer of each of the different facilities. You're only going to be a customer of one of them, and you get the full benefit. Whereas at a transit exchange, you want to minimize risk, so you want to be going to two exchanges, and you don't want those two exchanges to connect their switch fabric together at layer 2, because if they did, one problem might be likely to affect both of them. Price-wise, peering exchange is really simple. Cheaper is better. Cheaper is always better. That's why there's so much market force in favor of slightly subsidized ones that cost participants $0, or say under $100 a month, which many of them are also. So the bounding on that price is that it's no longer worth doing if it costs more than it would cost to ship the peering traffic through transit during an outage, right? So if you're figuring that a low reliability peering point might have, say, 30 minutes a month of outage on average, you just need to look at what the cost of running that traffic through your transit for 30 minutes a month is, right? As long as you can afford that, you don't need to pay for more reliability in the peering point. On the transit side, though, what is bounding the cost is the difference between what it costs to do it in exchange and what it costs to do if you have it backhauled to your own location, right? Because you can always just call up a transit provider, order a circuit to your POP, your location, whatever, and do that twice, have two transit providers bring it in, right? Alternatively, you can get circuits of your own out to exchange points and buy at the exchange points. The advantage to buying at the exchange point is that there is market fluidity there, which is driving prices down to market rates, as opposed to the premium that you pay for having it delivered to your own location, because the provider knows that once it's been installed at your location, they've got you for a term contract, blah, 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 and they know that you're inflexible in the contract, and they can extract somewhat more from you at that point. So that's what governs the cost that transit exchanges can charge. So in the real world, we look at that and see that transit exchanges can pretty routinely charge $10,000 a month for somebody to go and buy transit from several providers at good rates at high speeds and in a reliable facility, whereas at a peering exchange, even the really big ones have difficulty justifying prices of over a few $100s a month, right? Many of them are free, many of them are $100 a month, $50 a month, whatever. A very few get up into the $1,500 a month, and they're a tiny number that sort of serve both functions and are important enough globally that they can charge up in the same region as the more transit-oriented exchanges. But I think both my compatriots here will have a bit more to say about that than I do. So that was it for my slide set. We'll, of course, have discussion after the three slide sets. And yeah, Phil was up next.
Right, the few slides that I've got here are really going over what's kind of happening in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think they add a little bit more to what Bill's suggesting about how exchange points in general are heading. At least I hope they do. My interest in this is that I'm chair of APNIC's Exchange Point Special Interest Group. So have had some experience in the region working with some of the exchanges. Now, just a bit of background. Many of the countries still have no exchange points at all. In fact, the US or Europe is the exchange point for these countries, which is probably a bit of a bizarre situation for most of the audience here, but it's very real in our region. Those countries which have exchanges tend to have two types. They have the neutral exchange, which a lot of us know from the past, or they have this commercial exchange, which is probably a newer thing, and is probably closer to the transit exchange concept that Bill's just mentioned. Now, I've called this either a marketing exchange point, where basically it's the telco or a service provider coming along and saying, yeah, I'm going to use the word IXP to try and market my services because it's cool. That's generally what they do. And it's basically just a layer 3 transit service. Or the other one is a peering exchange, which is run for profit. The countries without exchanges, we've got lots and lots of regulatory barriers. Things like you will connect to the internet through the monopoly government-owned telco, or you will not connect at all. Or they have a dominant telco who's got the vast majority of the internet business. They got there first before any service provider got there. And the small ISPs don't have any chance against them, and they don't really have any of their own international bandwidth. Or the ISPs mistrust each other. There's quite a few countries where this is true. Connecting to exchanges means that they can steal my customers, is the common view, rather than the view of, if I connect to an exchange, I can steal their customers, which is what I try and encourage. Be positive. Countries without exchanges, the ISPs simply don't know, or they don't realize the economic advantages and savings. So we always go along, talk to them, and when the penny drops, they suddenly realize they can stop spending lots and lots of money on expensive overseas connections. They realize keeping local traffic local means less cost in international circuits, means more money for the internet locally, and surprise, surprise, they get local content, latency is improved, lots more customers. They also believe that an exchange point is very complicated because they hear about May East and May West and links and AN6 and PIX and so forth, and they see the huge switches, huge routers, and they think millions of dollars, and they say, ooh, we don't need this, too expensive, too big, too much, too complicated. And of course, equipment vendors come along and try and sell the biggest and greatest equipment too, which doesn't help matters either. The countries with exchanges, which is probably more relevant for the discussion here, they've established non-profit and for-profit IX operations following the traditional models that we've known in the past, or we have a dominant transit provider, and you have localized IXs, like in-city IXs for the smaller ISPs who don't want to have their transit traffic, local transit traffic going through the transit provider, or the marketing term, as I mentioned before. So that's generally what we've got. Now, some of you may know about the whole settlement issue that's been running around in the AP region for quite a while. Major AP telcos have lobbied the US government and the ITU about cost settlement on transoceanic circuits and internet traffic. The ITU has supported the cause, but of course the industry position hasn't changed one bit. And this has all resulted in a Pan-Asia IX movement. The idea is to link all Asia's IXs together. There's several different bandwagons all heading off in different directions, trying to do different things, trying to get different supporters. So I've listed some of the suspects there. There are probably more. So the idea is that it will create an Asia backbone, which will mean that Asian traffic will stay in Asia. It means that we won't need so much trans-Pacific capacity, and means we get free peering with the US ISPs. All these things I have heard people talk about as justification for the backbone. They ignore issues such as much Asian content is actually outside the region. Most of it's in the US, in fact. Who's going to pay for it all? How much is needed? And how do you control the usage? Somebody else will solve that problem. Who says that Tier 1 ISPs in the US will peer for free? Who says that any US ISP will share the trans-Pacific circuit cost? If the US ISPs don't want to get to Asia, why would they pay money to get there? Also, each country has very little interest in the content and activities of other countries in the region, and that's quite a big issue. So the various efforts underway to try and sort out what's going on. We've just had the APTEL conference in Palau in May, which discussed this. There was a proposal put forward there to actually try and promote exchange points. The peering exchange, which I very much see as how you should get started off in any particular country, and as the exchanges develop, they become more the exchange point model that Bill has been talking about. APIA, the Asia Pacific Internet Association, is trying to coordinate the diverse efforts. Have to try. And there's been talk of forming some sort of entity which is similar in concept to EuroIX, to try and get the exchanges to actually talk to each other, rather than everybody heading off in their own directions. And also a lot of efforts underway to explain the advantages of IXs in the IX-free countries, such as the Apricot Conference, which is sort of equivalent to NANOG, and various individual efforts in the region as well. Those are my slides.
What I've done is I've put a few slides together, basically summarizing some of my thoughts around this topic. It's been a topic that's fairly close to our hearts, what we're doing at XchangePoint at the moment. Certainly, a view that I've taken for a long time as an exchange operator is that I don't too much care about the commercial arrangements between the participants at the exchange, whether these are peering agreements or transit agreements or something else. What I'm interested in is traffic and peering, and the commercial means by which that's achieved is something that I don't actually have too strong views about. I think that we're in somewhat unique industry conditions at the moment, and one of the things that we see is that the cost of transit is possibly the lowest it's been historically ever. I think that that's probably a short-term artifact, that the cost of transit at the moment is actually well below the cost of what it actually costs to provide it. So long as the cost of transit is low, that means that the economic benefits of peering, particularly when you're not necessarily the first established peering point operator in a particular metro, are somewhat diminished. And I think that that means that over time, we will probably see a cycle in terms of supply and demand of transit capacity. In these terms, as a peering point operator, as an exchange operator, you've probably got to be flexible and work with both transit and peering and encourage what you feel is most necessary to develop the market at that particular point in time and to maximize the traffic across your exchange. Exchange point, peering point, there's an awful lot of terms that are bandied around. I like clarity in the definition of what I'm talking about, and certainly for the purposes of this talk and any others that I might give. When I'm talking about an internet exchange point, I'm talking about one of which there can be some transit or there can be some peering going on. In practice, there'll probably be both. I think it's fair to say that there are very few exchanges that are pure transit or pure peering. There will always be a mixture, and I don't see peering and transit as being dichotomies. They're at opposite ends of the scale. Actually, there is much more of a gradation of the same things happening at the same exchange and for the same ISP. This is something that I used to sum up where I think the market is at the moment. We've talked a lot about public peering, traditional exchanges. The bottom left part of that graph, essentially, that's well understood. I think it's also fairly well understood that the vast majority of transit sales have happened over private interconnects. It does happen, though, that there has been private peering over private interconnects. It's not as widespread as public peering or private interconnect transit, but it tends to happen with a specific requirement for it. For example, those peers that you're exchanging a particular high volume of traffic with, or where there are particular QoS or SLA requirements. It also tends to be a bit more common in the North American market than it does in, for example, the European market. I think, however, there's definitely interest in the marketplace now in terms of doing transit over public exchanges. And this is an area that's been neglected, but there are actually some strong impetus to do that. I mentioned that I thought that peering and transit were a continuum, and actually there's a lot of things happening out there in the market which are not pure peering agreements where there's pure sender keeps all settlement-free arrangements between two ISPs who want to connect their customers only, or pure transit where the small ISP buys capacity from the larger one. There are other arrangements, paid peering. They might be based on a fixed connection fee. Will only peers usually pay us to connect, to cover the admin, or a fixed recurring charge to cover the port. There are settlement-based peering agreements where you measure the volume of traffic at the end of the billing period, and one party sends a bill to the other. There are also people out there who are selling partial routing-based transit. They may sell you transit to those exchanges that they are connected to, but not necessarily to the whole internet. Short-term transit. A lot of ISPs, when they see transit prices so variable at the moment, don't want to get locked into long-term contracts, or they want a trial evaluation, or they want backup arrangements, or for particular projects. There's definitely a demand out there for short-term transit contracts. There's also a degree to which I think people are multi-homing more. The bandwidth brokers don't necessarily seem to be doing particularly well in the marketplace at the moment. There's also some of the larger ISPs are saying, well, we're not going to sell transit below a certain revenue threshold, therefore what we will do is we will only sell through a reseller, and there's some transit aggregators emerging in the market as well. So I think all of these things, I think in some ways it's signs of healthy innovation and evolution in the marketplace, but it does demonstrate to me that peering and transit are not simple black and white. There's a whole lot of shades of grey in there. So if you're a small to medium-sized ISP, you're buying transit, what is your optimal arrangements? How many transit providers do you want? You want resilience, but not at the expense of complexity. Do you want to use transit brokers or aggregators? Do they have a stable future? Do your conventional transit providers have a stable future? How do you avoid getting locked in? How easy is it to change your providers? And I think basically what everyone's looking for is flexibility. And it seems to me that transit exchanges are potentially one of the ways of giving you that flexibility. So, in terms of differentiation between what I would call a pure peering point and a pure transit point, I think some of the important points, the traditional peering points do not in general offer SLAs. Bill alluded to this already. But on the other hand, if you're selling transit and you're using the transit exchange as one of the vehicles to deliver service to your customers, you're probably going to have an SLA for your customers. You're going to want that to be backed up by the transit exchange. One of the more interesting things is some of the traditional peering points, like I think of 2 or 3 in Europe that do this, actually explicitly prohibit transit. So they say, we are a pure peering point. And there was a time when that maybe made sense, but the difficulty I have is, first of all, how on earth do you enforce that? I've yet to see a network monitoring tool that measures cash flow. Why exactly is it so evil to do transit across the exchange in the first place? What is the rationale? It's not clear to me how you do either of these things. I think another important thing is that there is a distinction between a transit point and a bandwidth broker. To me, the bandwidth brokers are actually buying transit in and selling it out again. They're transit resellers. They become the principal in the contract. The transit points, transit exchanges are effectively just acting as a facilitator. They're bringing the parties together and they're providing the physical interconnection capacity between them, but they're not actually involved in the commercial details of the peering arrangement or the transit contract. And I think something that's quite important in this whole differentiation discussion is that there is also differentiation in terms of the transit offerings. The bandwidth broker philosophy has been that there's no differentiation except in price. It's a commodity. Let's drive the price down as far as we can. But I think the reality of the way that most ISPs operate and sell their transit is that there are differentiations in there. I think that one of the interesting things is that when you're operating an exchange, you want to maximize traffic. You want to maximize traffic exchange between the participants. One of the interesting things is that a lot of the things that you can do to facilitate peering, you can also use to facilitate transit. simple stuff like making contact details available. If you want to facilitate peering, it's just a case of facilitating of publishing the peering the peering contact points. If you want to facilitate transit, well, it's probably a matter of promoting the sales contacts. But you can also make sure that you publish peering policy information for a large tier 1. The peering policy information might be, we don't peer, here's our sales phone number. But it might also be that provide a bit more information than here's our sales phone number in terms of the transit agreements. There are probably tools that you can do, email forms, email lists for distributing requests for service and for peering agreements. And potentially an exchange operator can continue this facilitation but stop short of the actual being a principal by providing tools, routers, for example, which collect all the peering routes available in exchange or collect all the transit routes available, and then publish these back to the participants in terms of summaries of what routes are available, what exchanges they go to, what peers they have, providing looking glasses and other tools that can summarize that information. So I think that there are definitely advantages in transit points, but it's by no means a pure thing. Some of these advantages also apply to exchanges, to peering exchanges as well. I think it's an interesting way of buying and selling transit, but I don't think that it's necessarily completely at odds with doing peering across the same exchange. And that's basically a summary of my thoughts at this point.
I think I'll try and guide a little bit of discussion on this by prompting things with a few questions. First of all, we've been summarizing very lightly here quite a lot of thought in this area, and we may not have really gotten across the big picture of where I think we probably all think things are going with services, transit services provided to exchanges. And I'm just going to try and sketch that out a little bit very briefly. That if you imagine, for instance, a European telco that's selling IP transit services and has ambitions of becoming global, and they decide that they want to start selling IP transit in Japan and Korea and Thailand, say. Each of those companies has incumbent phone companies and local competitive phone companies and so forth with local loops. And their customers, lots of potential customers in each of those countries that this European phone company might want to sell to. But this phone company is not going to want to get into the local loop business in 100 different countries around the world, or even 3 countries on the other side of the world. They're not going to be able to be competitive at it. They're not going to have trucks on the street doing repairs and installs. They're always going to be at a disadvantage in dealing with local loop relative to their on-the-ground competitors in that locality. And their on-the-ground competitors in that locality are obviously trying to sell IP transit services as well as local loops. So by contrast, they're a much greater advantage if they can simply touch down at one location, right? Come in at the fiber landing, get a couple strands into one facility, one exchange point that's a major one for the country in, say, Seoul or Tokyo or Bangkok, and then have customers deal with the local phone company to buy local loop to get to that exchange, right? Then the customer can buy directly from them in the exchange, and the only thing that's being provisioned is a VLAN or a cross-connect or maybe just an IP address. So the liquidity with which a sale can be performed is enormously greater at a transit exchange than in a traditional circuit-based transaction. The circuit, of course, still has to be pulled, but it's someone else's responsibility, which means that you can scale the growth of an ISP business much, much, much faster, or much more broadly, Of course, it also limits who your customers can be, and that's what I think Keith was touching on with the resale and aggregation market. That let's say that you are this big European phone company and you sell service in Thailand, right? Your target customer there is not going to be a small business. Your target customer there is going to be a local phone company or a large ISP there, right? Who then in turn will take care of local distribution and sales and so forth. And your entire market for that country might be 10, 15, 20 customers, but you can still be profitable at it if you don't have to make a huge investment in understanding the local business and understanding local provisioning in each of these different, many relatively small markets. So in that sense, I think it'll allow flexibility both on the provider and the customer side and be pretty advantageous for everybody. Is that sort of, can either of you guys elaborate on that sort of picture of the future?
I think that's true to some extent, but one of the things that exchange operators can do is, of course, to annihilate the distance between all the neutral colos in a given metro. And that kind of takes the local loop out of the question to some extent. If you connect all the colo facilities in a given metro area together using dark fiber and effectively extending whatever technology you're running the exchange over to the metro, then in a sense that becomes a virtual local loop. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. It can to some extent compete with the telco in the area, but well, if you've got an exchange, you're going to be reducing the number of circuits that the telcos sell anyway. It's impossible to avoid competing with them to some degree, and you can have significant benefits. If you're, particularly in the case of the transit exchange, if you're a transit seller, it means that you can sell to all the colo facilities in a given metro without having to pop them all. You can just go into one and then use the exchange to provide a local tail.
That's certainly a pattern that we're seeing in a lot of the largest exchanges. Links, what you're doing with XchangePoint, Seoul, are all facilities that have quite a few different co-location buildings under different management that are all tied together on the same switch fabric.
That's more of a phenomenon in the European market, I think, where you will tend to get smaller buildings in more densely populated cities. So you will even have the same colo provider having 2 or 3 facilities in the same city, and you really need to be able to do that to create a level playing field so that everybody can get access to the same transit and peering services. Even though particular colos filled up because they were the first ones in the market. Mae
West was obviously like that for a long time. The PAX has been doing that sort of thing in the U.S. Yeah. Can you guys talk a little bit more about what you perceive the differences between L3 exchanges and brokers and transit exchanges to be?
I think that the neutrality that you have for transit exchanges as opposed to bandwidth brokers is much, much more important. Typically, your bandwidth broker will be taking some margin percentage of the actual transit fee, and I think that leads to a much less neutral model. I think that this point about being principal in the contract is really very important. I think in these days it also means that from a positive point of view, the exchange operator is not taking the risk of being the principal in the contract. But I think that examples of what I would regard as bandwidth brokers, Bandex, Rate Exchange, to some degree, the Internap approach. In general, these people are operating an AS, and that AS is buying transit in and it's selling transit out. For the kind of approach that we and other transit exchange operators take, we don't do IP routing on behalf of anyone except ourselves. And all we're doing is providing a layer 2 pipe, and the IP routing is happening between the parties that are negotiating it. the similarities, of course, are things like tools to compare the transit offerings. There's really no reason why these can't be provided just as much by transit exchange operators or indeed peering exchange operators. You can use the same tools to make peering decisions as you can to make transit decisions to a large degree. And I think that no, that's okay. That's enough on that topic, I think.
All right. So, any thoughts on it?
Yeah, living and working in probably a more developing part of the world. I mean, the Asia region is quite diverse. Where we've got Japan, Korea, who are very much developed and as far developed as North America is when it comes to a lot of the internet. And then seeing other parts like Southern Central Asia, where the exchange points are a coming thing, as I kind of alluded to in the presentation. Very much I find the developing parts of the peering exchange is the first thing that goes in there. That is, if the telco hasn't got there first and set up the monopoly internet service. So very much there, having thought about this over the last few weeks since being invited on this, I think the peering exchange is very much what you see first happening in the marketplace as such. And as the internet economy develops, the exchange point becomes successful, commercial operations, whether they're the telco or greenfield, new providers come along, they will try and set up some kind of competition to the exchange point, which is probably what they call commercial exchange, which tends to be more a transit provider. Certainly in 3 or 4 countries that I've worked in, I've been pulled into projects which involve building an exchange, which is actually some are layer 2, most are layer 3 selling transit services, and they do fit into the transit exchange model. So, I mean, I certainly believe, if you look at a lot of the Asian examples, we start off with a peering exchange in the very early days, and we move to the other end of the spectrum, the transit exchange in the sort of latter, well-developed days. In fact, a lot of the Asian providers look more towards Europe for their model rather than the US. I don't think they really understand what's happening in the US anymore from the exchange point perspective, whereas the European model is still, I don't know, it's probably halfway, and that's the type of thing that they try and follow in this respect.
I think the European situation has developed in a lot more kind of linear fashion and is a lot more stable right now than in the US. The US had such kind of economic turmoil for a while that nobody could really tell what they were doing. So the situation on the East Coast in the U.S. is not one that I think any of us would have imagined 2 years ago. Are there questions from the audience? Okay, well, one last question to you guys then, and we'll wrap up. So the thing that puzzles me, that I've been trying to figure out, is if we have this sort of what should be an ideal market of a peering exchange and, say, 2 transit exchanges in a metro area, and the peering exchange is very cheap, say $100 a month, and the 2 transit exchanges are more expensive but perfectly supportable in light of what people are willing to spend, say they're a few $1,000s a month each, and most people are customers of both of the transit exchanges, and they're buying and selling transit there. If that's the case, why bother with the peering exchange at all? That is, how is it that we continue to see a thriving market for peering exchanges even at a very low cost when transit exchanges coexist in the same region? I mean, like, take London, for instance, where we've got the 2 big colo facilities, right, Telehouse and Telecity. We've got Links, we've got XchangePoint, and we've got LowNap. Right?
I think that this comes back to what I was saying, that I don't see there being a sort of clear-cut distinction between what is a transit exchange and what is a peering exchange. Both benefit significantly from critical mass. I think the view that we're taking on this is that there are actually 2 different services that you can offer over the same infrastructure. Particularly once you start doing VLAN stuff and 8021Q sub-interfaces on the customer router side, it isn't actually that hard to build an infrastructure which will support both transit and peering services, and whether your participants use that primarily for peering or transit is to some extent how you price and differentiate the different services that you're offering. One of the things that we're doing, for example, is negotiating interconnect with one of the smaller exchanges in London, because potentially they will get some benefit maybe from peering with some of our customers, but our customers who are selling transit see that as a marketplace that they can sell additional transit to. So I think that a bit of competition is good, both from a market point of view and also from a resilience point of view, but there are also critical mass benefits, and I think that there is room for more than one exchange in each city. I think that there is room probably for slightly more transit exchanges in a given marketplace than there is in terms of peering exchanges. But I think in reality what we're going to see is 2 or 3 exchanges per city, one or more of which is going to have main emphasis in peering, but which will do some transit, and the others which will do mainly transit, but will also do some peering as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with that, just from what I've seen happening in my part of the world. People like redundancy, so that there's some redundancy there. There's still the concept that the peering exchange is cheap. It's generally a good service. It works pretty well, and that's what they want. The transit provider, the transit exchange, is always there as backup. It's seen as the more expensive path to take, and people always want to try and save money in any possible way that they can. Again, in the Asian region, a lot of the exchanges, hard to distinguish whether they're peering exchanges or transit exchanges as such, as you get both functions happening on both. But people will tend to try and go to 2 things rather than rely on just one thing.
Okay, well, I think that wraps it up for us.